Chapter 10. Rue unhooked the latch and gave the cabinet door a yank. She thought it felt too heavy for such a small door until she realized that it was actually much larger than it looked. In fact, it was not a cabinet at all, but a door that stretched all the way down to the floor, its edges cleverly concealed in the beadboard wainscoting. As the door opened, cold, damp air rushed out, smelling of stone and mold. Inside was a tunnel, neatly hewn out of granite. The ceiling was low, but the tunnel was wide and so long and dark that Rue could not see the end of it. Rue stepped in, careful to let the door stay slightly ajar. There were gas lamps fastened to the wall, their glass globes shrouded in dust. Whatever this was, it looked as if no one had been there for a very long time. The crying was louder here. The farther Rue walked down the tunnel, the louder the crying became, until it seemed to pulse out of the stone walls. Rue could make out rhythms in the way the noise rose and fell as if it were saying something, though she could not hear any real words. Finally, the crying grew so loud that Rue squinted through the darkness, almost expecting to see the filmy shape of the yellow girl emerge in front of her. Instead, she saw a door. It signaled the end of the tunnel. The pitch of the crying rose, like a question, then stopped. The crying had come from the other side of the door. Rue was sure of it. Reaching out, her hand closed over the knob, and she turned it a little, making it squeal softly. She winced, then paused to listen. There was only silence, but she sensed the person on the other side of the door was listening for her too. Taking a deep breath, she gripped the knob and tried to turn it more. It wouldn't move. She pushed against the door, but it wouldn't budge either. It must have been locked from the other side. "Is someone in there?" Rue whispered. She waited, but there was no answer. Stepping back, she looked around to see if there was another way in. There were no other doors, just solid stone walls all around. Still, something caught her eye. It was on the wall near the floor, a disk of smooth blackness. Rue walked up to it, then crouched down to get a better look. It was an opening in the wall, perfectly round and so cool to the touch that it must have been lined with metal, though it was too dark to see. Rue dropped down on all fours and ducked her head inside. She couldn't see much, so she shimmied her body into the opening, crawling cautiously across the slick, cold metal. A second later, she realized her mistake. The metal floor suddenly gave way beneath her, inclining so sharply that she found herself shooting headlong down the slippery tube. It was so surprising that she slid down several yards before she thought to brace herself against the sides, stopping her descent. But this was no good either, since she couldn't turn around in the tight space and it was too steep to climb back up to the top. She had no choice but to keep going down. Stretching her fingers out ahead of her, she pressed them against the metal, which enabled her to awkwardly crawl downward. The tube went on and on. She could not see the end of it. Her arms soon grew tired from holding herself back, so she relaxed her hands and let herself slide. She quickly picked up speed, and just when she thought she'd better stop herself again, the tunnel angled up slightly, slowing her down. In a moment, the tunnel walls opened out, and she came to a halt on top of a flat metal platform. Cautiously, she rose and looked around. She was in a dark room with a low ceiling canopied with pipes. Wires hung down from some of the walls, and there were large metal tanks in the corners. She was in the basement. It was then that Rue realized she had just traveled down the body chute, the tunnel of the old sanitarium had used to hide its human losses. The thought that she slid down the same chute as so many dead children, bundled in yellow sheets, made the nape of her neck feel icy. It was a long, long time ago, Rue told herself. Years and years. Still, she hurried off the platform and gazed around the dark room, letting her eyes adjust so she could find a way out. There, along the walls, she could make out the shape of a door. She started towards it, but something rat-like passed close to her feet and made her jump. She never minded snakes or spiders or mice or other things that people were normally afraid of, but rats made her feel queasy. She stared around at the floor, trying to spot it so that it wouldn't surprise her again. A movement from beside an overturned pail caught her eye, and a black shadow leapt forward. Ruth sucked back her breath, but then she recognized the black squirrel. He approached slowly, stopping and starting, as if giving her time to remember who he was. Rue knelt down and smiled. Is this where you live? In this nasty basement? The squirrel stood up on its haunches, its bright eyes trained on her for a few seconds. Then it dropped down to all fours and scurried away behind a metal panel that stood floor to ceiling that went into the room. The panel had many switches and timers, but there were wires dangling from the back of it that looked as if they had been cut. Rue waited for the squirrel to return, and when he didn't, she followed him to see where he had gone. The panel, she discovered, had a flight of wooden stairs behind it, and the squirrel was sitting patiently on the third step, waiting. At the sight of her, he darted up the rest of the stairs and slipped through a small hole in the ceiling. Rue frowned up at the hole, noting that it was, in fact, a gnawed-out bit of a trap door lying flush with the ceiling. Climbing to the top of the steps, Rue put her hand flat on the little door and gave a small push, expecting it to be locked. To her surprise, the door flipped over on its hinges and a whoosh of warm, moist air hit her face. The smell was musty and earthy. High above her, she could see the pale early morning sky, making her think that she had found an entrance to the outside. But in a moment, she realized that she was seeing the sky through hundreds of tiny panes of glass shaped in diamonds and forming a clear dome that stretched up as high as the house itself. Climbing the last step, she hoisted herself out of the basement and gazed around in astonishment. The glass dome enclosed what looked like an ancient, brittle jungle. Dead trees towered up out of the dirt floor. Their branches were thin, many broken and hanging, trapped within the spindly arms of other branches. Thick, ropey vines twisted around the dead trees, climbing up to the very tops and then tumbling down in thick gray sheets like grim waterfalls. Clinging to some of the panes on the dome were brown creepers, pressing themselves against the glass as though pleading to be let out. Underfoot there were spiny bushes and collapsed ferns and limp brown plants, and everything, all of it, was dead. It was the saddest and most beautiful place Rue had ever seen. "What happened here?" she whispered. There was only silence, yet she could feel an answer trying to push out, mute but struggling to be heard. Stepping in farther, she saw a patch of slate gray beneath the underground and found a flagstone footpath. She followed it, nudging away the dead plants that covered it most thickly as she went. The path twisted through the atrium, following the contours of a gentle incline until it ended below a shelf of rock that formed a small cliff. There were smaller rocks alongside the little cliff, and these Rue used as footholds to climb, with some difficulty, to the top of the rock shelf. Beside it stood a large boulder. Rue sat on it and looked down at the ruined garden, at the towering gray trees and the wraith-like tangle of drooping branches. If there were ghosts in this house, she thought, this is where they would live. A scratching sound from above startled her. She looked up in time to see a branch on one of the great trees shiver. She did not believe in ghosts, but still she held her breath as she stared at the tree. Its trunk was completely encased by a thick vine that coiled around it right to the tip of the uppermost branch. And there, on the narrow end of the branch, was the black squirrel. Rue watched as he leapt to another branch and raced across it. How can you stand it, being the only living thing in this place? It was then that she noticed a patch of leaves on the ground near one of the atrium walls, which were much darker than the rest. almost black. Sliding off her boulder, she walked to the dark spot and kneeled down to inspect it. To her surprise, she found that the leaves were damp. Everything else in the garden was bone dry, yet here. She leaned forward and poked a finger deep into the leaves. The soil was wet too. She gazed around, looking for the water source, finally finding it when she glanced up. There was a broken pane on the dome, close to the edge. The morning light was growing brighter now, and the rain had stopped, but Rue could just make out the path of rivulets trailing down the wall of the atrium and ending near the patch of damp leaves. She raked the thick layer of leaves to one side and yanked up the dead grass beneath it, exposing a patch of bare soil. With the sun beating down on the damp spot, maybe something could grow there. She squinted up at the ceiling, searching for other broken panes, and found several more. It was all the encouragement she needed. Rue went to work, tugging at the dead grass and plants around the damp spots, gathering up dried leaves and piling them in a corner. The black squirrel inched up to her once to see what she was doing. He came so close that she could have reached out and stroked his fur, but Rue was so busy working that she hardly noticed him. She worked for hours until she was drenched with sweat and so thirsty that her throat stung. Finally, she sat back on her heels, exhausted but happy. The sun was pouring into the atrium now, bathing the garden in pale light. The little plots of bare, dark earth looked so promising that she leaned down, put her ear to the ground, and listened. Astonishingly, she heard nothing at all. That had never happened before. Even in the crawl space under the trailer, in the middle of winter, she could hear life beneath the soil. It was a languid, subtle sound, but it was there. In this garden, though, there was only silence. It was the nothingness of death, frighteningly permanent. The garden had been erased from the world, and in the same way that her father had been erased, extinguishing everything that he was, the good and the bad. Once more she pressed her ear to the earth. Concentrating fiercely, her sensitive ears strained to hear a sound, the smallest sound. She stayed that way for a long time, motionless, eyes closed. Then, after many minutes, she thought she heard something. It was weak and frayed around the edges, and it came and went like shallow, feverish breathing. Sometimes it fell silent for so long, Ruth thought it had stopped altogether. But after a while, it would start again, struggling. So fragile, so almost not there. Stay alive, Rue pleaded.